This is Sophia, and welcome to Philosophy with Sophia. So, today I wanted to talk about existentialism and absurdism because those two philosophies are very similar. They're not obviously completely similar, but they do share some fundamental pieces, so I thought it would be a good idea to talk about them together. So first, existentialism. This is a philosophy that was most popular in the late 19th century and 20th century. This is around the time when it was thought of. But it became more popular after World War II because of sort of what happened during World War II. And as you'll see, this philosophy sort of makes sense if you think about the things that happened during World War II. So basically, existentialism is a philosophy that says that life is meaningless, but it also says that each individual creates their own meaning to life, and in that way it's a very individualistic philosophy. It focuses a lot on the individual and the choices that the individual makes. So one of the major philosophers in this philosophy is Søren Kierkegaard. He was a Norwegian philosopher, I believe, or somewhere in the Scandinavian countries. And he's the founder of existentialism, although, of course, it wasn't called existentialism when he first talked about it. And so he was sort of the first to talk about this thing of life having no intrinsic meaning, or in other words, that there's no meaning that's just automatically there in life. And so the sort of process in existentialism involves things you might have heard before: existential dread, existential crisis. I know that's a big thing on the internet, so probably heard that one. So the process starts with existential angst, which is like when you have this feeling of realizing that the universe is basically meaningless at the heart, and that you lack purpose, and this can give you feelings of anxiety and dread, and then it would culminate in an existential crisis when you feel all of this feelings of meaningless, pointlessness, like, why are you doing what you're doing? And that sounds very depressing, but existentialism is not actually a depressing philosophy, because the point of it is that you get to that existential crisis and then you yourself assign meaning to your life, and that's how you sort of get through the existential crisis. Because Kierkegaard said that there were 3 ways to deal with this crisis that you would face. One being to die, which is a silly way to resolve a problem like that, and another being to believe in some spiritual or religious idea, which Kierkegaard thought was untrue, but that might be necessary for some people to believe in to, deal with an existential crisis like that, and he thought that was okay to do, even if it technically didn't exist. And the last way was to just accept that life was absurd and didn't make much sense, and there wasn't a meaning just assigned to life, and then you could move on from that and create your own meaning of what you thought your life should be. And that's why existentialism is one of my favorite philosophies, because I think it's really important for people to do what they want to do in their life, and this is sort of a philosophy that revolves around that, and it can give you a lot of power to feel like the meaning of your life is whatever you want to make it, which I think is very cool. So some well-known philosophers that you might have heard of are Nietzsche, Sartre, and of course Kierkegaard, the founder. And Nietzsche is a German philosopher. Sartre, I believe, is French. I don't actually know that much about Sartre, so if you're interested in existentialism, you might want to look him up. I know a lot about Nietzsche because he's one of my favorite philosophers, but if I were to properly explain all the details of his philosophy and his bio and all that, it would take a whole video, so I might do that later. But yeah, that is basically a short introduction to existentialism. And now the other thing I was going to talk about is absurdism, because it has very close ties to existentialism. So absurdism comes from sort of the same starting place, I would say, as existentialism. They both start with the idea that life is meaningless. Of course, they differ in some points, otherwise they would be the same philosophy. So one of the major philosophers involved with absurdism is Camus. He sort of looked at the same three ideas that Kierkegaard looked at, of how you would solve the problem of your existential crisis, but he did not think that believing in faith was a good way to go, and so his followers, also many absurdists, think that believing in faith is not a good solution to the problem. He called it philosophical suicide, so he really wasn't a fan of it. And basically the point of absurdism is that the same thing, life is meaningless, but that it's intrinsically absurd, so there really is no point to searching for a meaning, because the meaning itself would also be absurd and meaningless, so like it doesn't really make a difference. Some well-known philosophers are obviously Camus, because he was sort of the founder, and I couldn't actually find any other philosophers, but I do know some playwrights like Samuel Beckett and Tom Stoppard, who are both playwrights who have written different plays which sort of fall into the theater of the absurd, which is a branch of the theater, but I would have to go into a lot of things to explain that, so I'm just going to focus on how their plays relate to philosophy. I think one of the more famous of Beckett's plays is Waiting for Godot. It's about two men who sit in a sort of wastelandy place, and they're waiting for someone named Godot who never seems to really appear, and they're not even sure if they're supposed to be waiting for him at that point, or maybe they're supposed to be waiting for him last Sunday. And a lot of things in the play don't really make any sense, and if you'd read it and you didn't know about absurdism, it really wouldn't make any sense at all, but it's supposed to be a reflection on how absurd life actually is, just as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard is supposed to be like that too. It's a very strange play where all sorts of strange things happen, and doesn't make much sense if you didn't know that it was theater of the absurd. Although I think that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead leans a little bit more towards existentialism than absurdism. And the main points of both these plays is that life is sort of absurd and there isn't much you can do about it. But since Tom Stoppard's play is more towards existentialism, there is a sort of point to that play that you shouldn't just go along with the absurd things that are happening, that you should try to sort of like find your own way through them, because one of the characters at the end of the play says, there must have been a point somewhere where we could have said no, we just missed it. And they end up both dying at the end, obviously. It's not much of a spoiler given the title of the play, and if you've read Hamlet you would know. But the point is that they just blindly go along with what people tell them. Someone will be like, do this, and they'll be like, okay, and they just keep going, and they don't really know why they're doing things. They just do them because someone else is saying that they should, because they get carried along in the action. And the point is that life is absurd, and if you just let yourself get carried along on the action, you'll get lost in this absurdity. But that if you stop and say no and question it and find your own way, then you'll get out of that just bombardment of absurdity, and you'll be able to find your own way in life. So in the end, I guess a sort of summary of these philosophies could be absurdism is kind of in the middle. Existentialists are very sure that that you can create your own meaning to life, and that that's the way to sort of get out of this existential crisis. Absurdists are a little bit less sure, it's absurd, so should you really search for a meaning, because that meaning itself is going to be absurd, but it doesn't really matter in the long run because everything's absurd anyway, so if you find something that you think holds meaning, sort of like that. And nihilism is less sure than that there's a meaning, and that is going to be the subject of the next video. So, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot, and I'll see you next video. Thank you.